Okay, so that's a core one. It's easy to apply. Stereotypes and prejudices, that's another problem. Takes a great deal of work. Oh, that's a hard one. High degree of training and experience. I mean, just think of how many years of training and experience it takes to be really good in business. It's a lot, because what are you doing? You're learning how to match up what you're watching, what you're seeing in your work with what actually should be the case. It doesn't feel satisfying when you're working with complexity. And that is a negative, because it means that when you develop a very sophisticated set of relationships, it doesn't have the simplicity of a nice, tidy match between obvious similarities. And so you end up, is it really what I'm looking for? How do I know it? And then this was a new one that I came up with when I was just thinking through the implications for this presentation, because I had to come up with negatives. And I realized that a profound one is that when you are thinking strategically and the people around you are not, it can actually lead to alienation from the group. That is, strategic thinking, unless other people are thinking it with you, they're caught not only here, but they're in a worse case. They don't see the relationships you're developing. They actually think of you as a less moral person. That is, when you're doing that, if everybody's doing it together, it feels very good. But if you're not doing it together, and this is complex kinds of reasoning, it's easy for the group to feel quite disconnected from the person doing this kind of work. So if you're thinking strategically about where your department needs to go, it almost certainly means to your staff that there will be changes coming, and that doesn't feel good to them, that they're going to be dealing with changes. And if they're not thinking strategically around the same points that you are, they don't know what you're up to. It just doesn't feel good, and so now you've got a growing gap. This is one of those situations where communication around what you're doing is really important, because you need to have other people thinking into that strategic mode, not because they're going to be doing correct strategic thinking, but simply because you want them to accept your thinking once it's finally produced. You want them to understand what has gone into this matching, because if they're not doing it, and it's complicated, it doesn't feel right to them, because it may not even feel that right to you. Isn't that wild? That this is a type of reasoning that can actually lead to people being alienated from each other. I mean, strategic thinking, what happens if you decide we're going to change our objectives for next year? And all of your staff are oriented around that objectives, and you're saying, nope, we're going off in this direction. They don't understand why you've drawn to that conclusion. They're going to think, there's something wrong there. This is just crazy. We've been doing this successfully for 10 years. Why would we now go off in that direction? It doesn't feel right. It's a wild transition. But if they know that there's a profound change in markets, new technologies, long-term expectations around the department as a whole, then they begin to get a sense of why this makes sense. Okay? They'll go with you. But otherwise, it doesn't feel right for you to be thinking strategically while they're busy thinking tactically in terms of their next bonus, or equitably, what is fair in terms of how we should be treated in the workplace. It just, they're in one kind of framework, you're in a different, and this one really quickly leads to a sense of divorce. So you've gone in a different direction. That leads to not just discomfort, but leads to a sense of immorality. When there's a gap, the bigger the gap, the more it doesn't feel any more like thinking, and the more it feels like morality. The more it feels like somebody is behaving badly. And it's always the individual who's different who's behaving badly, and if you're the manager, you're the one behaving differently. So you've just set yourself up to be disliked by your staff. Not because you're doing anything wrong. In fact, you may be doing exactly the correct thing. But it doesn't feel right to them because this is a difficult form of reasoning. If they're not there with you, it's a moral gap, not just an operational gap. Anyway, so traditional ethics. This isn't that common in most traditional ethics, except when you start looking deeply, you realize it is present, though people are often not comfortable with it. It has to do with that thing So situational ethics, I don't know if anybody's heard of situational ethics or relativistic ethics. They have a very bad name. But they're actually about something profound and important, which is matching the correct ethics to the correct situation. That is, how do you know when to be tactical, when to be equitable, when to work with communal dynamics and identity, when to build a hierarchy? How do you know when to match the framework, the moral framework, to the situation? That's a strategic match. That's about thinking strategically about types of ethics. That leads people very quickly to feel uncomfortable with what you're doing. And so there's a wide level of disgust with situational ethics. And yet when you start thinking it through, you realize, yeah, people are doing it all the time. It is a constant. We just don't think about it, think that that's what we're doing. Then professional ethics are also filled with this. If you start looking at organizational or professional codes of ethics, you'll realize they don't make any sense. As rational tools, they actually don't make rational sense. They've typically been accumulated in bits and pieces to fit situations. Okay? That is, they're collections of rules based on experience. And they may be profound and reliable as rules for different types of situations. That's good. But how do you make sense of it? Well, the answer is the only way to make sense of it is to think in terms of situational or strategically locating the ethical principle, the actual ethical rule, in terms of what are the situations people in that profession or that company are going to face. So if the corporate guidelines say no accepting gifts, well, that typically represents an issue that they've had around how to build good relationships depending on cultures and situations, and typically comes out of, say, American or Canadian or British cultures where gift giving is seen as a violation of interpersonal boundaries. You do not give people gifts unless you're in that zone of the familial, the family. That is, you're trying to create that sense of unity and identity. So it's very common to say, hey, we don't do that thing. So it's clearly identified. It isn't identified as fitting a particular principle. It's simply a code that fits the culture and the way the organization emerges from that culture. And then my favorite one of all, theological ethics. If you start looking at how priests and rabbis and imams put their rules together, you realize that they're just matching. They're just trying to match divine revelation to actual practices. They're always working at it. It isn't consistent. They're trying to be consistent, and they'll tell you they're being consistent. The fact is they're not being consistent, because divine revelation is rarely consistent. Rarely? Never. Unless you're a Buddhist, in which case it can be consistent depending on the form of Buddhism. Buddhism is amazing. I'm not a Buddhist, but it's the only religion that has a rational core. It's just brilliant. The Buddha was fascinating that way. But other religions are all working with erratic kinds of divine revelation, and then it's the ethicist's job, the theological ethicist's job, to try and make sense of this stuff in a way that will allow people to live lives that feel kind of coherent. So that's what they're doing. They're doing strategic thinking. They're matching divine revelation and principles to situations, and they're always juggling between them. Jewish rabbis, I think, have the most difficult job, because they've got the 600 and odd commandments that are designed for one people in one situation, and now they're in a completely different one, but they only have the 600 commandments. So how do you make them work? They're just doing amazing work of kind of thinking it through, rotating the rules in space, metaphorically analyzing them, trying to find ways of relating them to practice. Christianity is much easier. It has like 2 principles. You can do anything. It's really simple. In fact, it's too simple, so codes of ethics and rules just accumulate incredibly. But you can choose whichever you want. Yes?
This 3 part is a kind of on a negative part or positive part. Because actually with these 3 points,
Yeah?
actually you mention it as an ethic, but it's a kind of unethic. Because who decide to choose a sexual ethics?
So what you're saying is that these imply a certain hierarchical ethic as well, power structures.
Yes.
Some people can enforce them on other people. Yes.
Yes.
But
So
is
it's
that
kind of
unethical?
unethical, and it's kind of negative point,
No.
no?
No, it's completely positive.
How when, for example, for the first one, when someone match, who want to match the ethic for the correct situation in the point of view that person, but maybe
That's
the other
right.
person
That's
doesn't
right.
think the other point
So
of view.
the reality is that strategic thinking always leads to conflict. But that's true actually of all of the others as well. They all lead to conflict. As soon as you are doing anything other than working as a homogenous group where everybody grows up in the same culture, even the same, well, I was going to say same family, but if, you know, if any of you are part of families, conflict, kind of natural. It doesn't matter. Conflict is embedded everywhere. What happens, though, is the conflict takes different shapes in the different moral or emotional approaches. That is, there's a different route to the conflict. There isn't a different necessarily amount of conflict. And the moral emotion always arises as the gap, the conflict gets greater and greater. The more we feel a disconnect between the position we take or feels right to us, and it's very much it feels inside of us, feels right, the more that feeling right approach doesn't match that of the person next to us, the more there's conflict between us.
Or for the divine revolution, each
Mhm.
religion want to put her divine
Yep.
revolution. Or
Yep.
that's the person,
That's right.
divine revolution.
That's
so
right.
maybe the other person with the other religion, it's not appropriate for
That's
them.
right.
So it's becoming negative. So how we
Well,
put it on the positive?
Is it negative? I mean, isn't that just reality? Isn't reality learning to negotiate? I mean, none of us get what we want out of life. We negotiate a compromise between our goals, our objectives, and what other people are prepared to do and allow us to do.
If we talk about the organization,
Yeah.
about a specific organization, and these ethic situations happen in the organization, all culture, all people from all societies, they should follow the organization ethics. It means that organization have some rules,
Mm-hmm.
and in ethic and moral position, staff employees, they should follow those rules. Because of that, those rules have to solve the cultural conflicts and social conflicts and
Yeah.
give the solution.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, but my point of view is that you cannot involve your religion to the as an ethic to the organization culture. You cannot
yes, you can.
choose it by your point of view and point it on the organization
Okay.
culture.
But if you work in the organization, you should do that.
We're raising some really important questions, which we're going to actually come to maybe next week and certainly the week after, which is how you look at the kind of the bigger picture around the conflict between them. Because this week you're looking at national economies and the differences and what it's driving it. Next week you're looking at national cultures, and one of those core points is religion and how it emerges within and shapes the value system. And then we're going to be looking at what is religion, how does it emerge from human dynamics, and therefore get a certain sense. I mean, if you look at North American codes of ethics and professional ethics, and you understand Christianity, you just go, they fit together. Now, there are different kinds of Christianity, and they match different kinds of Christianity. That is, North America, despite its protestations otherwise, is a profoundly Christian area. Not in the formal sense that the Christian religion is identified as the religion, but in the sense that its values and principles have suffused the society. They emerge in different ways, and not everybody listens to them, but they're there deeply influencing the way the culture and organizations, professions, companies, the way they all interact and the way they've developed over time. So there's some very profound impacts there. And the best way of comparing that is by looking at, say, the United States on the one side and, say, China or India on the other. There's a reason why China and India are two of the recommended countries in our materials. because culturally and economically they're so profoundly different from North America. But if you start looking at any global environment, you begin to see after a while, unless you're looking at Western Europe, you've got profound differences at many levels within the culture. So I'm not terribly worried about that. But those two are particularly distinctly different in their approach to ultimate questions of meaning from the Western mindset. So I'm not sure I quite responded to your question, did it? Kind of? Yeah, we'll come back to this. That's why we have 2 weeks to look at the issue of religion. It is so important. We'll end up looking at both how religion arises in the brain and then how world religions have variously interpreted this kind of stuff. Okay, see if I can wrap this up in 5 minutes. Organizational applications for this are just all over the place. I just identified 3 primary areas, but if you start looking, you realize that it doesn't matter what department you're in. Strategic thinking, this kind of matching thinking is going on all the time. But at the largest level within organizations, so you think in terms of strategic planning. What is strategic planning? It's a complex organizational effort to understand what the goals are and then apply them through tactics to situations. That is, you've got 3 levels of match. You've got your goals, your tactics, and your situations, and you're trying to find how to put the 3 together. Complicated stuff. But it's about the matching, looking for matching goals, situations, tactics, and back and forth you go. And it's not a simple process. It's an iterative process. You try this, does it work? Is it the right match? Oh, maybe, maybe not. And then we try something else, think something else through, looking for the best match. The human resource department and every developmental activity it undertakes is typically about trying to match people to the situation, job descriptions to the needs, developmental approaches to the person and position, and then you start looking at recruiting methods, materials for the kinds of jobs. It's complex, but they're doing that. Actually, what led me to this is the assessment that you did has a whole section. One of the things it's evaluating you on is your strategic thinking. And what I have found is that good human resource people score high on the strategic, very high. That is, they're doing a lot of this. They tend to see the whole world through this matching idea. They're always looking for match. It's not always the best way of looking at a situation, but they're just so used to doing it that I realized, hey, the reason their brains are oriented that way is because that's what they do all day long in their job. Because that's what they do in their job. They're always looking for the match. It's not their job to look at incremental growth, long-term growth. Fairness, yes, that's part of what they do as well, but what do they mean by fairness? Again, it's fairness in the context of a situation. So even if they're looking at what's fair, they're typically looking at it strategically. What is the right fairness for this situation? And then the marketing department, they're always looking to match goods and services provided with the market needs. Always looking for that match, always playing around with match. And then methods and materials to reach the customers. What is the correct way? So marketing departments are really strongly oriented in this direction. But it's everywhere in organizations. Okay, questions, thoughts? This wraps up strategic thinking. Powerful stuff. We're doing it all the time. You're being trained in it now. That's what your degree is about. It's about the matching function. Extremely capable, powerful stuff. Allows us to assess the world around us and do things in ways we could not otherwise do them. I know. It's a lot to take in. I don't know. I don't know if you find this as interesting as I do, but it's just, find it just profoundly interesting. Okay, so let me reset. So I'm actually getting how to do all this stuff. Okay. So on then to the last of the kind of operational ones. Now we've moved